This show is in tribute to Peter Brook. Now, many of you who follow the Gurdjieff work will know him for being the director of the movie version of the book Meetings with Remarkable Men. He was a theatre director, and I think his first play was Dr. Faustus, which was Christopher Marlowe's version of Faust, which was back in 1944. I have a video version of his stage direction of the Mahabharata, which he also produced. He's written several books on theatre as well, including The Empty Space, which I have briefly read, and how to use that empty space. The empty space within us and the empty space out there on the stage. As Shakespeare says, the world is a play, is a stage ready for us to act out our lives. And Peter Brook wrote a biography, and he's got on the back cover, and I quote, "I have called this book False Memories, not because I want consciously to tell a lie, but because the act of writing proves that there is no deep freeze in the brain where memories are stored intact. On the contrary, the brain seems to hold a reservoir of fragmentary signals that have neither colour, sounds, nor taste, waiting for the power of imagination to bring them to life. In a way, this is a blessing." End quote. And Gurdjieff talks a lot about using constructive imagination. But when I was reading through Brook's biography, he talks a lot about how he came across Gurdjieff work. It began with one of his ex-girlfriends he bumped into, and he'd gone to her house. And whilst he was there was a newspaper cutting on the floor. Or was it the mantelpiece? Let me read it to you, actually. This is quoted from his biography. "A newspaper cutting was lying on her mantelpiece. As we spoke, I looked at it idly until I realised that it was a review of the book I had seen in Paris at the home of Gurdjieff's friends. In the book, In Search of the Miraculous, its author, a Russian philosopher named Ouspensky, claimed that the ancient teaching had been transmitted to him orally by a figure whom he indicated only by the initial G. In reading the book, I had wondered what name lay behind this enigmatic letter, and G now explained to me that G stood for Gurdjieff, and went on to say, 'A book is one thing, direct teaching is quite different.' And this, of course, and I'm going to end the quote there, is very important for us, that we need direct teaching. And Gurdjieff himself said that we must find teachers, but it's quite difficult in this day and age, isn't it? Which is why I always try and encourage people to go back to the books and read the books, and hopefully your magnetic centre will develop over time and you will bring the books to you. And it's interesting that Brook says here that he'd already been told about the book or seen the book by his friends when he was at his friend's house. So he was noticing already that this book was there, and it seems to keep coming into his path, and this is what would be happening to us if we develop our magnetic centre. Anyway, I shall continue with the quote from the book. So he's asked about Gurdjieff, who he is, and his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend has told him direct teaching is quite different. "What do you mean?" I asked. "There is a person in London who is responsible for this teaching," she said. "Why did you never tell me about it?" "It's not something to talk about, it's far too personal, it is very difficult, but if you want I can put you in touch." "There is an old tradition that says that every night before going to sleep one should thank the person who leads one to one's teacher. I cannot say I've been very faithful to this suggestion, but as I write, the gratitude is there." A few evenings later I was walking through the gate of a large old London house in a quiet tree-lined street called Hamilton Terrace. The front door had frosted glass plates set in vertical panels, and in one of them was silhouetted the shadow of a waiting figure. The image inflamed my imagination, exciting me with a sense of mystery, and at the same time arousing my suspicion. Part of me was longing for a chance to scoff at this adventure that another part had accepted so readily. A moment later all strangeness vanished, as the shadow became a normal person who quite simply was waiting to admit the visitors. Now description becomes unimportant. There was a room, there were people, but this is not what matters. The setting was quite ordinary, but the quality of the encounter was unique. I heard simple words that at once rang true, words that spoke of an understanding that can only be communicated directly, not by writing or by theory, but whose basic principle is that nothing must be accepted passively. Everything must be questioned and verified, for a truth only acquires meaning and conviction if it has been tested, rediscovered, and proved step by step within one's own experience. I had many layers of resistance, but there was no mumbo-jumbo, which was reassuring. Instead, I was being asked to work with ordinary people, with no flights of fantasy, no romance, something that forced me to face and accept, with difficulty, my own essentially ordinariness. The teacher was Jane Heap. She was American, short, dressed like a man, with closely cropped grey hair. At the time of Gertrude Stein and James Joyce, she had been a brilliant literary figure in Paris. There she first met Gurdjieff, and she saw at once that all the efforts and activities that had so richly filled her life thus far were simply part of a search that had not yet found its direction. Deep down, she had always felt a need for another quality of understanding that could give meaning to her various talents and link the outer world to another purpose for existence. "We have a world outside us, a universe within," she would often say. And in George Ivanovich Gurdjieff she found the guide she needed to penetrate into this enigmatic space. She was gentle, ferocious, and compassionate. When she spoke, taking as her starting point any simple question, she would open great vistas of understanding, linking the tiniest detail of everyday life to the laws and forces that condition all humanity. Her idiom was a rich, slangy vernacular from the Midwest, bringing an earthy common sense to everything she proposed. When need be, she could give her listener a sudden shock, like the grand slam of a bat on a ping-pong ball when it is close to the net. Through her, I began to discover that tradition had another meaning from the sterile, old-fashionedness I so detested in the theatre. I learned to understand the Oriental way of hiding knowledge like a precious stone, of concealing its sources, of making it hard to discover, so that its value can be truly appreciated by the searcher who has been willing to pay the price. She showed how every religion rapidly destroys the purity of its origins by offering too readily to others what one has not made one's own by hard practical work. There are many admirable books that give an indication of what this teaching can mean, and it is not for me to try to add more words to what must be experienced for oneself. It seemed to me at the very first meeting to contain essential truths, and this seems equally so more than 40 years later. A school of work based on esoteric ideas is not like an ordinary school. One does not progress grade by grade. It is not a clinic, for one is never cured. At first, a higher reality seems to be somewhere out there in space. Gradually, painfully, wondrously, one comes to see where it really lies. "What is my biggest obstacle to a real understanding?" I asked Jane after a few weeks. The reply was instantaneous: Peter. So that was a reading from Peter Brook's book, which I thought was quite important to read to you people who's listening and doing this Gurdjieff work. We have a world outside us, a universe within. So that's what Jane Heap was saying to her students, and I'm sure many of you have read Jane Heap's books or know about her. She was in contact with Gurdjieff, worked with Gurdjieff, took the work out to the world. And we have to remember that the outside world is obviously going on in a mechanical way, though it should naturally, it's working harmoniously with the universe and the cosmos and the divine source. But us humans interfere with that and stop the harmonious workings and try to make it mechanical or to fit our own world. And we have to also look at the universe that's within us so that we can become attuned to the universe that's out there. And that is one of the revelations, I suppose, I've noticed for many years, that everybody's trying to make the world fit into their ideal. Whereas the world is outside of us, so it's running its own operations, or we should be running our operations within to try and fit in with the cosmic running of the universe. But also I find it interesting that they're talking here, that she is talking about that people are looking for quick answers. And also I've experienced people that have asked me to explain Gurdjieff in 2 sentences, or then asked me to introduce them to their teachers, my teachers or teachers I've known over the years, or want their names so they can go and find them themselves. But it is quite difficult to do this kind of thing. You have to be introduced, obviously, or maybe one will find them yourselves. But one has to be prepared to open oneself up to a teaching. I've run various groups myself over the years, and I've noticed many people bring their own ideologies and ideas to a teaching and want to try and transform their own ideas, well, into the Gurdjieff work, rather than we empty ourselves to take on the Gurdjieff work to work within us. As she says here, or as Peter Brook says here, a school of work based on esoteric ideas is not like an ordinary school. And also, it's not like a clinic, for one is never cured. We're not cured. Instead, we're learning how to deal with this world and to hopefully contact our higher selves so that we can have a better understanding of the true reality out there. You know, he goes on to say at first, a higher reality seems to be somewhere out there in space. So once we've got that awareness, we're attaining to get to that. And of course, the biggest clue for all of us, or the biggest lesson for all of us, is that very last sentence when he asks, what is my biggest obstacle to a real understanding? And she replies, Peter. And that goes the same for all of us. What is our biggest obstacle to a real understanding? Usually our mechanical selves. Now, as we know, Peter Brook's made the movie Meetings with Remarkable Men and an adaptation of the book by Gurdjieff. And to do that, he worked with Madame de Salzmann. So I wanted to read part of the book where he's discussing meeting Madame de Salzmann. Early one morning, time stopped. I picked up the phone, then turned to Natasha to tell her that Jane Heap had died. The powerful magnet at the centre of every activity was gone. What were her last words, we asked, only to realise at once the absurdity of the question, because the whole of a teacher's life work is her only statement. There was grief, there was emptiness, and a useless scramble to fill the void. But the pain of deprivation needed to be cherished and respected, and only after mourning was allowed its time and place could new lines of life emerge with their own determination. You will see, said a friend when I first met Madame de Salzmann, she is like a fan which gradually opens until more and more is revealed. After Jane's death, Natasha and I went frequently to Paris, where Gurdjieff's work was being maintained with increasing intensity by Madame de Salzmann, who had been close to Gurdjieff since she had met him in the Caucasus during the First World War. Through her own unremitting struggle, she had gained the capacity to transmit to others a unique quality of experience, and I now made a vow to myself always to be available whenever the opportunity arose to be near her. I would like to be able to draw a portrait with words of this remarkable person, but I know how inadequate this will be. In my work with actors, I've learned that impersonation only succeeds if it can capture the rigid areas in which a personality is imprisoned. Someone whose life flows freely has none of the rigidities on which imitations or even descriptions can comfortably hang. Madame de Salzmann had achieved this freedom through a life devoted to the service of that unknown source of fine energy that can only become manifest when the human organism is completely open in body, feeling and thought. When this condition is reached, the individuality does not vanish. It is illuminated in every aspect and can play its true role, which is to bend and adapt to every change in need. Madame de Salzmann would always rise graciously to welcome a visitor. She would sit upright, still and contained, and would respond with laughter or seriousness, finding precisely the words and the idiom that corresponded to the age and understanding of the listener. Her speaking was not for herself. She was never carried away by her own memories or her ideas, out of an awareness of what was needed, out of listening to the other person's state. She would speak directly to the person so as to evoke a meaning or encourage an action to arise. She was always present, as close as the need demanded, yet in this closeness she was never to be grasped. No one could hold her, and she held on to no one. I'm just going to end the quote there. Now this is quite interesting, I believe, because you're now seeing how a person who is using the work to live, Madame de Salzmann was a representative of the work, but she wasn't doing it through ego. She had her centres harmonised. And I find it interesting that she says he says her speaking was not for herself. She's not talking about herself all the time. She has an awareness of what was needed in that moment when she's with somebody, when she's talking to someone. Now, I've met many people over the years who talk at people. Obviously, they're not work people. These are just people I've met. I myself have been called up at people's houses where I've been stuck there having to listen to their life stories. And I understand people want to talk about their life stories. It's all they have in their life. They want to tell people about what they've been through, the traumas, the ups, the downs and such like. But a person in the work has to be there, obviously, for them people and see how that is just mechanical talking that's going on. They're not working with themselves in the now, they're living in the past. Whereas we, as people that are doing the Gurdjieff work, we should be attaining to be like de Salzmann, having an understanding, being there for people, but at the same time aware of who we are. And one of the sentences that rang out for me was, from what I've just read, was Madame de Salzmann had achieved this freedom through a life devoted to the service of that unknown source of finer energy that can only become manifest when the human organism is completely open in body, feeling and thought. When this condition is reached, the individuality does not vanish. It is illuminated in every aspect and can play its true role, which is to bend and adapt to every changing need. How beautiful is that? That is something we are attaining to become by doing the Gurdjieff work. I'm going to carry on reading now from Peter Brook. I'm going to continue from where I left off. There are many reasons for describing a human being as remarkable. For Gurdjieff, the essential quality of a remarkable man or woman was the capacity to watch equally over the lamb and the wolf in his or her care, to cherish the tenderness of the one and the ferocity of the other. To give to each its place is only possible if there is a special kind of presence that reconciles, unites and holds them both in balance. Often Madame de Salzmann would describe how at her first meeting with Gurdjieff she had immediately recognised this remarkableness in him. From then on she had stayed by his side, working with him through a multitude of forms of teaching and conditions of life, watching over both the wolf and the lamb. I'm going to end the quote there. And this is something we're working with within ourselves. We have a wolf and a lamb within us. The wolf must learn to lie down with the lamb. But as he says here, sometimes we need the wolf to work for us. Sometimes we need to have the lamb. It's very difficult to meet people that have this remarkableness that people are talking about. I've met people who at first I thought were remarkable, and over time I've realised, no, this was just an ego or a mask they were wearing. But I've also met people that are remarkable and are genuinely remarkable. But they're not going out there bragging about it or showing it off. I've worked with people recently, in the last few years, who are asking where these people are and why they aren't leading the world and why they aren't, showing off what they know on YouTube channels or such like. And it's difficult for them because they're trying to come from a, how to put it, a different, it's not a different point of view, but it's working with what they need to do and what they can put forward. They can't let their ego overtake them. But what they're doing, wherever they are doing the work and affecting that area that they're with and those people they are with. I'm going to continue reading from Peter Brook's now. At Gurdjieff's death, Madame de Salzmann found herself virtually alone, inheriting the gigantic and volcanic output that Gurdjieff had left behind. All over the world there were groups of students left rudderless, in a state of confusion that seemed destined to splinter, distort and degrade the material that they had been given. There were unpublished writings, a bewildering quantity of musical compositions, an even greater number of dances, movements and exercises that she herself had taught and of which she had the truest living memory. Recognizing that uniting all these strands was now her unavoidable role, she devoted all her energy to this task, travelling indefatigably between Europe and America. I would meet her often and was always fascinated by the same observation. Wherever she went, she seemed always in the same place, her stability unaffected by outer change. I'm going to end there. That's something that we will become when we stabilise ourselves, harmonise our centres, when we understand the work and can live the work, not just walk. We're not just talking the talk, we're walking the talk. Now I shall continue. One day I asked Madame de Salzmann a question that gnawed at me constantly, for it was connected to all my major decisions in life. On the surface, all seemed balanced and harmonious, and I certainly had no right to complain. But deep down, nothing could quench a sense of meaninglessness, both in my own activities and in the world around me. Yet to solve this by breaking away or dropping out seemed arrogant and futile. It was a personal version of the ancient dilemma of determining what belongs to Caesar and what truly belongs to that something else. Just going to end the quote there. And Gurdjieff often talks about finding that something else. That's what we're working towards. And I've had people keep asking me, what is that something else? It's something we have to work on alone and find. Though if we can find the right teachers to guide us, they will again guide us to what that something else is. And we should be discovering that as we're doing the work. I'm just going to continue Peter Brooks. He said, I have an inner search that I cherish and respect, but also a working life for which I am grateful and cannot despise. Both seem valuable, but in different ways. What can help me to assess how much I should legitimately give to each, so as to maintain a balance? She looked at me for a moment, then answered quite simply, come back at 9 o'clock tonight. When I returned, to my bewilderment, it was not to resume our conversation, but to find myself included with others in a session that she guided, leading step by step to a complete silence. I had expected something to be said that would clarify my question, only as time went by did I see how precise and practical her seemingly indirect answer had been. It was the answer of direct experience. It became clear that it is the quality of silent wakefulness, informing and uniting the organism from moment to moment, that gives meaning to each choice and to every action. On an ordinary level of awareness, all choices will suffer from one's lack of true vision. And as I so often painfully experienced, we torture ourselves with decisions that in fact we are in no position to take. The purer the inner state, the clearer the vision. That evening she led us step by step to taste what that state might be, and how in it contradictions can be resolved and priorities become real. In a cruder state, all arguments are valid because all choices are the same. The enigma is how to discover what can lead us to another, deeper, truer state. I still believed that somehow or other I could fabricate this state for myself, and I had to face the awkward truth that even this natural desire can become the greatest of obstacles. Even the sincerest of wishes can block that special opening to which all aspiration tends. Effort only has a place if it leads to a mystery called non-effort, and then if for a short instant one's perception is transformed. This is an act of grace. Although grace cannot be attained, it may sometimes be granted. One has to let go of the leaf to which one is clinging, but it takes no more than another leaf to blow by for one to drop again into the usual state of confusion. I'm going to end the quote there. So this is something I think is so important, especially about grace. Grace is given to us if we are lucky, if we are worthy, if we have the merit, have deserved the merit for it. But what is grace? That's something for you to go and ponder upon. But I also find it interesting that he talks about how he's struggling within. He has that confusion of what he should be doing. It's something we all go through. Am I making the right choice? Am I making the right decision? Do I know what I'm doing? But it is important sometimes to do some kind of exercise where we're sitting in silence, awaiting perhaps the answers. But it is, again, a difficult exercise because our mind is constantly flowing, constantly throwing things at us. It's like dark forces are whispering negativities into our mind. Light forces are trying to convince us to do this work because we know it's for the higher good. It's something we all have to put effort into and struggle with. And this is why it's an ongoing work. And earlier I was talking about how he was saying, I'm not cured. None of us get cured by it. We just learn how to live in this world, really. I'm paraphrasing there. But I do know many people, and I myself was looking for a cure to what was going on in my life and why my life was so topsy-turvy and upside down and inside out, rather than living and being real. That's it. We find a way of doing that. Is that a cure? Being real and living in the moment is very different to living in our topsy-turvy world. Now, hopefully you've all seen the film, Meetings with Remarkable Men. Even more important, hopefully you've read the actual book, because all the gems are in the book, and of course the film does not cover everything. So I'm going to read the part where Peter Brooks talks about how the idea came to make the movie Meetings with Remarkable Men. One day I was driving through New York with Madame de Saussman, when she turned to me and said very lightly, "Why don't we make a film of Meetings with Remarkable Men?" These few words changed the pattern of my life for several years, weaving a thread through our first period in the Beaufs. I had not an instant of doubt. Her proposition to film Gurdjieff's autobiographical book took precedence over every other plan and project. This was no act of sacrifice. It was simply a moment when all the options fell into place in an unmistakable scale of values. Once again I could see that decisions are not made. They arise when something more essential than our own ideas breaks through the clouds of our wishes. Then one neither counts the cost nor determines the result. In this case, the reward lay in the intimate daily work with Madame de Saussman. Hour after hour we would sit together, she a motionless centre of collected energy, as we went over every detail of the script. I could feel my own thinking lifted to a previously unknown level of intensity through her presence, through the challenge of her demand. My first reaction had been to imagine the dynamic, colourful film we could make, reflecting the extravagant and provocative sides of Gurdjieff, who during his lifetime acquired a rich coating of lurid and fantastic myths. This seemed admirable material for an exciting picture, but I soon discovered that it was of no interest at all to Madame de Saussman. Her aim was not to make an interesting film for its own sake, nor to pay homage to the man she had known so well. Her purpose was to give to the spectator a direct taste of that something else she had experienced with Gurdjieff over the years. just going to end there. Now, there's been many criticisms about the film, and I'm sure many people would make it in a different way. Yeah, I had some of my favourite chapters are definitely not in the movie version, but that's my subjective point of view. I'm sure Madame de Saussman was trying to make the film in such a way that it experienced who Gurdjieff was and the message he was trying to put across. But then who am I to say? I'm going to continue reading. The first scene of the film is entirely her own creation, for it is hardly indicated in the book. Whenever we met to work on the script, we would go over and over this opening sequence, and as we always began again at the very beginning, we found we could seldom proceed any further. Apart from the dances at the end, the opening remains for me the most successful part of the film, as the meaning of the whole story is caught here with hardly any words, just through images and sound. The sequence presents an ancient competition held at rare intervals in a remote and mountainous part of the Caucasus. To win the competition, a number of musicians must improvise freely, and it is the special meaning of freedom that this scene dramatically throws into relief. The condition given to the participants is merciless in its precision. Each note must lead out of the previous note with an absolute and logical inevitability, yet at the same time it must be melodious. If the phrase is predictable, there is no true melody, and if it is too ornamental, then the clarity of its progression is lost. The line of melody, once launched, must never be broken. It must continue to develop until it reaches a particular intensity that can make the rocks vibrate. This one tone is very hard to find, but once it is there, the whole mountain will respond with an echo that is the proof that the contest has been won. This image comes from the depths of a mythic imagination, but in a film it had to have its own reality, its flesh and blood, and for this we needed the help of traditional musicians. Many were heard, and gradually a group was assembled. Then the difficulties became clear. As each one began to play, he would attack the opening phrases with his usual confidence and skill, but invariably Madame de Saussman would draw his attention to the moment when this initial intention would go astray. Maybe the musician had permitted himself just a slight slackening of attentiveness or a little moment of self-indulgence, maybe no more than the pleasurable repetition of a phrase he enjoyed, or even the elongation of a note with a touch of sentimentality, and then the melody's natural flow would be blocked. It was poignant to witness in rehearsals how each musician would recognise and acknowledge that there was a point where the acuity of his listening had slipped away. For this reason, the scene of the musicians is like a blueprint of the whole film. It puts under a microscope the difficulties of every searcher, whatever his field, and shows how it is that so many searchers, however ardent and sincere, drop by the way. Very exact conditions govern the evolution of intentions within each human being, and this scene gives a vivid expression to a vast idea. The highest energy is always there, Madame de Saussman would say, ready to act if we are there to receive it. As she spoke, it sounded so simple, but working with her revealed how far we are from understanding what this subtle link may be. I'm just going to end the quote there. So, even during the making of this film, Madame de Saussman was trying to help people, through the work, to develop themselves so that they can give their best, not necessarily their best with the ego, though that was what was interrupting various filmings through the actors and the musicians, but to help the work then come through that film. She doesn't want ego coming through the film, she wants the work to be being represented. I'm just going to continue with Peter Brook and his narration of the making of the movie. One of our greatest difficulties lay in the film medium itself. The cinema is by its very nature overwhelming. Its images and sound invade every corner of the brain, washing away all sense of distance, making our identification with the action complete and irresistible. In the theatre, a line of verse, a song, a dance, even a leap in the air are often all that is needed for the most secret of meanings to appear. With the camera, however, the obstacle is far greater, for to try to film the invisible seems to deny the very nature of photography. In this film, the evocative power of Gurdjieff's words had to be replaced by images, by an exact rightness in the choice of people and of the natural backgrounds to which they relate. Only if these elements were found could photography make each scene a living document and not just a fiction. I'm just going to end there. And this is something that I stress often in my videos. Go and read the books by Gurdjieff himself, or go and listen to the recordings that people have made. There are many out there of Gurdjieff's writings, because, as Peter Brooks is explaining here, it is quite difficult to put it across in an image. Though theatre has a much more powerful way of putting things across. You're living, you're watching it live, you're being there in the moment as that actor's putting forward, or them dancers are putting forward what they are trying to impress upon us. So read the books, get the books. I should put up my, I have got somewhere the recordings of In Search of the Miraculous and Meetings with Remarkable Men and other books. Most of them are on the Internet Archive. I haven't put them all on YouTube yet, but you can download them as audio only on Internet Archive if you look me up there, or check through my website that gives you a direct link to it. I shall read some more from Peter Brook's book. Now the same problem presented itself in a different form. Beyond the fine faces we could pick up in every bazaar, we needed professional actors. We had a story to tell, and these actors could not be found on the spot. We had to return to the parts of the world where performers are trained, recognising that what we needed in this case was not within an actor's normal range, especially when he is trained in the midst of 20th century urban life. Gradually we put together a most interesting group of performers from many countries and backgrounds, each of whom was in some way touched by the theme. The role of Gurdjieff was the most difficult to cast, as the actor had to be convincing for those who had never seen him, and not offensive to those who had known him well. As we needed to find someone whose physical type would immediately suggest Gurdjieff's Greek and Armenian origins, we investigated the vast pool of actors in the United States who had Middle Eastern backgrounds. To our disappointment, we found that the acquired mannerisms of American culture, the way of holding the body, the slouch, the laid-back walk, the nodding head, had completely obliterated all traditional characteristics. We auditioned in London, in Paris, in Athens, in Cairo, to no avail. Then it was suggested that perhaps in Yugoslavia, which had a very rich and interesting film and theatre activity, we might find the person we needed. I saw many actors in Belgrade and was immediately struck by their powerful physiques, their strong personalities, and their fine acting skills still linked to deep ethnic roots. But none of them spoke a word of English, and they had no interest whatsoever in working abroad. Then a young man from Montenegro, Dragan Maksimovic, entered the room. The way he walked, the expression in his eyes, told us that we were at the end of our search. Having established through an interpreter, he knew no English, that he was willing to leave the country, we invited him to Paris to meet Madame de Saussman, and we set up an audition in a friend's garden. While waiting for the camera to be ready, he sat patiently on a stool. Then, at one moment, he crossed his legs, and leaning forwards, he clasped his hands together on a stick he had picked up off the ground. His body relaxed, yet poised and alert. Madame de Saussman was delighted, recognising a characteristic attitude of Gurdjieff that Dragan had unwittingly assumed, simply through the power of essential roots and types. Of course, Dragan knew nothing of the man he was asked to play, but what he had gathered had fired his imagination, and he was prepared to commit himself to everything that was needed. His first challenge was to learn English, so we enrolled him in a school in London, where during very long hours, day after day, he worked with passionate dedication in an austere, self-imposed solitude until the time came when he could both understand and speak an English that was fluent and free. As an actor, he recognised that there was nothing in the film for him to act in the usual sense of the word. This was a daunting task, but he was undaunted. Each painful difficulty that he encountered helped him to discover what a searcher can be. even though at times the demand to go way beyond himself made every fibre in his body cry out in despair. I'm going to end the quote there. Now, isn't that interesting about how this actor threw himself into the work? And this is what we have to do in the Gurdjieff work. We are throwing ourselves into the Gurdjieff work so that we can do it. We can make it within ourselves. Now, of course, the film went on to be made and seen by many people. I think it was shown in art cinemas throughout the world and is still available on DVD now. Not many people that have no inkling of the Gurdjieff work really understood it. But some received that spark from it, and it went on to help them towards the Gurdjieff work. And I'm just going to read a little further in the book about where Peter Brooks is talking about when the film was shown. When the film was shown, some people were disappointed, finding it too simplistic as cinema, too exotic in its imagery, too naive in its narrative. Certainly, when at last the Dinster monasteries reached, the dancers assembled there in white are unmistakably European, and this is hard to swallow from the point of view of normal storytelling logic. But the unique and unknown dances themselves are what matter. They have never been shown before, and these movements are authentic, recreated from the complex principles that Gurdjieff had discovered during his journeys and had transmitted directly to Madame de Salzmann, who in turn had taught them to her pupils. It is interesting to see that when the film is shown, most spectators are deeply touched by these dances and exercises and are totally unconcerned by their lack of verisimilitude in the story. Verisimilitude, sorry, I had trouble saying that word. Verisimilitude. Anyway. I know that Madame de Salzmann herself was not fully satisfied with the film, although she never said so to me. I feel she needed to be confronted by a thinking even stronger than her own, to which she would have been ready to yield, but without that friction, which I certainly could not bring. What she truly had in mind could not find its expression. Nonetheless, I think that anyone who watches and listens to the film in the way that it proposes can experience a purity, a special quality that is entirely her own, and that can give one a direct taste of what a search is, of what another level of awareness can mean in a way that no words can equal. When Madame de Salzmann died at the age of 101, she seems to be taking the centre of life with her. Now, after a long and ashen period of grief, the reality of the present has re-emerged, a present that is waiting to be served in a new way through those who had the fortune of sharing what her influence transmitted. Life continues, a new generation arises, and the world's need for a living body of understanding is more vital than ever. The enigma of tradition and the mystery of transmission cannot change, but the great set of keys is always there. That's the end of the quote that I'm going to do from this, but isn't that important? The great set of keys is always there. Gurdjieff has given us the keys to understanding how to find that something. And hopefully this little video will influence you to go and find that something. Go and read the book In Search of the Miraculous, which is Peter Ouspensky, of course. Go and read the book Meetings with Remarkable Men, that is Gurdjieff. And watch the film to be inspired by it, to help you find that something. Thank you for watching. And may you be the truth seeker that goes forward, finds the truth, finds that something, and finds life to be real. Because remember, that is only when you are.